Hello and welcome to our Pathways webinar. Today we are just reminding you before we actually begin the webinar to move any of your electronic devices, including your iPods or iPads, as well as any cell phones, away from your computer, because that might interfere with the sound of this. And we also recommend that you close all your file sharing applications like your emails or your Pandora or anything like that as well. That just improves the quality of your webinar experience. And if you are checking, if you're experiencing audio difficulties, check your audio pane as well. Today we're going to be doing questions through the chat feature only, and so you can send any of those questions through the chat, and we will take those, but we're going to be saving questions until the end. And also, a recording of this webinar as well as the presentation slides are going to be available on our website relatively shortly after the webinar. So those will be available for you to download or to listen to the webinar again. And so, next slide please. I'd like to introduce our webinar today, which is the NeuroLeadership in Systems of Care, what brain science tells us about youth participation in adult leadership. And we are here with Lori Ellington and Lacey Kendrick-Burke. Next slide. And so Lori Ellington is the CEO of NeuroLeadership and a NeuroLeadership coach at 0 Point Leadership, and Lacey Kendrick is the Executive Director of Youth Move National. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Lori and have her start the presentation.
Yes, hi, good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are. Thank you so much for that gracious welcome, Chris. And also, thank you so much for giving us the opportunity to have this conversation with such a large system of care community. I know Lacey and I are both very excited and passionate about this topic. This is a new discussion and conversation because this field of neuroleadership, the neuroscience of leadership and systems change, it's very new in general, and it's very, very new to the system of care communities. So I'm very grateful and honored to be here today to talk with folks about some fascinating findings in the field of neuroscience as it relates to leadership effectiveness and systems change in systems of care. Next slide. Before we talk about what our focus is today, I want to talk just a little bit about why I'm so passionate about this field and why I'm so thrilled to be partnering today with Lacey, who has really the expertise and the experience from her own personal journey, as well as being a leader and a change agent in systems of care right now. My years of experience in being a leader and being a clinician in systems of care and a coach and a consultant have really made me interested in why change is so difficult and unsettling for people, and what is it that we need to do to be able to make that easier for folks. And so for years I have been really looking at what's happening at the neurobiological level, and when we really lift up the hood and see what's happening outside and below what we can consciously see and below our awareness and what's before us, we find some fascinating insights that tell us why it's so difficult for us to engage others in change. And with respect to this conversation that we're going to have today, we're really going to talk about not just systems change and why people find that unsettling, but also how this relates specifically to developing not only adult leaders in systems of care, but also youth leaders, and then what that dynamic between adult and youth leadership looks like from the lens of brain science. And so I'm so thankful to be here, very passionate about this topic, excited to be talking about these findings with you, and very excited to be partnering with Lacey Kendrick-Burke. And so I'm just going to hand it over to her. And Lacey, if you want to talk a little bit about why you're here today, I know that folks would love to hear that.
Sure. Hi, everybody. Welcome. Like she said, I'm Lacey Kendrick Burke, and I'm currently the Executive Director of Youth Move National. My experience with youth leadership goes back to when I was a young person. At 15, I entered the foster care system and consequently mental health services. Throughout that process, I learned to do a lot of advocacy work for myself and my younger siblings. And then I had a lot of opportunities to then move into a more system macro level of advocacy and realize that leadership was a huge part of what I was doing. And I know that this topic is really important to me, and I'm really excited about it because it gives a lot of answers and insight into how young people develop and what a huge influence the opportunities that they have while they're developing and going through these opportunities, what an impact it has on their development and how they have those opportunities when they're younger. I know that that's one of the biggest things that influenced me and allowed me to be where I am now is those opportunities to not only have leadership experience and skills to develop, but also the relationships that I had with other adult mentors and adult leaders who kind of showed me the way. And so I knew that I was drawn to them for a reason. But Lori actually will talk about the physiology behind why I was drawn to that and how that helped me develop into where I am now. And so I primarily focus on youth engagement and youth-guided services. I started working in a system of care whenever I was in college, so 22, and I've done a lot of work with the child welfare system as well. And now I'm back working with systems of care and making sure that young leaders have opportunities, but then also have the skills and the relationships with adults and peer mentors that they need. And you'll see how all that ties in as we go through the webinar today. So,
yeah, thank you so much, Lacey. What's really nice about how Lacey and I are going to have this conversation today and this conversation with you is I'm going to be pulling the insights and the findings from the laboratories of the neuroscientists, and she's going to actually help put those into context by talking about what implications that might have for being a young leader in systems of care, how that applies to the systemic change that she's engaged in. And of course, many of you that are on this webinar today. So what we're going to do, what we want you to walk away with today is really just a high-level, overarching, better understanding of how the physiology of the brain influences organizational change in our system of care communities, and then how can we start thinking about applying these insights and these findings in the field of modern neuroscience to youth and adult leadership practices and systems of care. And when I talk about modern or contemporary neuroscience, what I'm referring to is the fields of social, cognitive, and affective neuroscience. Those are all relatively new. They're growing fields, and what they're really helping us discover is what do we need to do to actually improve how we learn and work together. If they're helping, social, cognitive, and affective neuroscience is giving us a better insight and understanding into what drives human behavior within our social networks and our social settings. And so I'm going to be pulling lots of the research that I'm going to be pulling is from those fields. There is so much that I could talk about with you today, but what we have decided to do is really just hone in on kind of a couple of the golden nuggets and a place that we feel like would be good to start this conversation about how neuroscience relates to change and to leadership development. And then, of course, what's most important is we really want to hear the insights and the new connections that you are making as you digest this information. Telling you about these findings is not going to initiate change, but hearing what connections you're making inside your brain is the way to actually start changing the way we think and the way we approach change in systems of care and the way that adult and youth leaders engage with each other. Next slide. All right, so let's just dive in here and start talking about what NeuroLeadership is. And I'm guessing that most folks have not heard this term before. There could be a few of you until this webinar. It's a relatively new emerging field. This term was coined by David Rock, Dr. David Rock, in 2006. And since then, the field has just been blooming. And so what are we talking about when we say NeuroLeadership? What we're doing is we're really just kind of lifting up the hood and investigating what's happening at the neurobiological level when we engage in decision-making, creative problem-solving, when we're actually able to regulate our emotions so that we can think clearer, and when we engage others, when we collaborate with and influence others in developing and growing themselves as leaders, as well as engaging in reform in systems of care. And then what's really happening with our underpinning biology when we're facilitating positive change. You can find out more about NeuroLeadership. We're going to be talking about it today in the context of youth and adult leadership in systems of care. But there is just a wealth of resources and information for you at the NeuroLeadership Institute. We are partners with them and members of the Institute, and they are doing a fascinating job of disseminating the most recent neuroscientific findings as it relates to change in leadership. I don't have the website on there, but it is neuroleadership.com or .org, so easy to get to. Next slide. So in a nutshell, NeuroLeadership is the neural basis of leadership and effective and positive change management practices. Anything in particular you want to say, Lacey, with respect to how this relates to your work and what has come up for you when you learned about NeuroLeadership?
Yeah, I think one of the important things that we're going to be discussing is how young adults and adolescent development kind of are influenced by this concept of NeuroLeadership. And we're hopefully going to give you guys some real takeaways that you can do every day to make sure that you are creating those opportunities to influence young people as you are including them in your efforts for systems of care development.
Yeah, great, fabulous. Thanks, Lacey. Next slide. So why do we want to talk about brain science? Why is it important? Well, as I noted when I started this conversation, one of the reasons why it's so intriguing and interesting to me is because it really does shine some new light on why change is uncomfortable for us. Whether this is personal change or it's organizational change. This applies to your family systems. It applies to any social setting, the workplace setting. But why is it difficult? And neuroscience really does put a different lens on why we find it a bit unsettling. It really helps us to understand how we can engage the human brain to solve problems from a different perspective than where we were when they were created. So we know that we can't solve problems from the same mindset that we had when the problems bubbled up before us. So how do we engage the human brain to creatively solve problems and to be more innovative and make those novel connections to do things in a different way? It really gives leaders a way to pull people together and introduce just the idea of engaging in change. And then it helps leaders just, okay, how can I move forward and implement transformation efforts and develop myself and others in this process based on what I know about the physiology of our brains. And then something that neuroscience, I think, especially in systems of care, has already made some really good strides is what's happening. It really helps us understand what's happening with the adolescent brain and how the adolescent brain is developing. And today we're going to take that a step further and talk a little bit about how the development of an adolescent brain actually impacts their leadership development journey. And I know, Lacey, you wanted to talk a little bit about that and share some of your thoughts.
Yeah, one of the things that we talk about in adolescent development is that we have learned that there is a period as the prefrontal cortex develops, which is your higher level thinking, high level thoughts. That's not developed yet in young adolescents, and it starts developing, well, fully developing, and it starts myelinating. So that means that young adults are developing their brain based on their experiences as they go through adolescence. And so the key thing to remember here is that they're not solidified yet, and they're not fully developed in their prefrontal cortex yet. And so the opportunities that they have during this phase are really influential. And some of the research out there shows that their brain at this time is as easily influenced as as in the first few years of life. And so, a lot of times we think that teens are going to be teens, or they're just going to do what they're going to do. But in reality, this is a great opportunity to influence how they're developing into adulthood. And some of the things that they focus on now are what they're going to be good at later, and that's what's really going to develop for them. And so that's why offering leadership opportunities is so important at this time, because their brain is very easily influenced at this time. And as you provide them those opportunities, that's what they're going to develop into, are leaders. If you are able to engage them in a way that offers them that opportunity, that motivation, and then also mirroring some of the behaviors. And I know we're going to talk about some regulation and co-regulation later in the webinar, but that's, during this time, adolescents are so easily influenced, and so that's really the big thing to take away from this point.
Yeah, thanks, Lacey. That's just beautiful. I love how you describe that we have such this opportunity, I just want to hone in on that word, to really help young people develop the hardwiring in their brain for the first time that it's actually getting hardwired. As you said, we're going to talk a little bit more about what that means in the context of leadership development and change. But as adults, our frontal lobe is already, as you stated, myelinated. So whatever we focused on during those younger years, we're very, very good at. So we have an opportunity to help young people develop as leaders in the context of the relationship between adults and youth leaders. And I think there's something very powerful there. We're going to talk a little bit more about how we can really harness and leverage that opportunity. Next slide. So we're going to unpack things here just a little bit more by starting out talking about what the science tells us doesn't work, which is surprisingly counterintuitive to what we think. What we're learning is that what most of us as leaders have engaged in to try to help people either develop their own skills or to engage them in transformation of systems and organizations, what we're finding is that what we have been doing is actually giving us the opposite of what we intend. And so this is, when I talk with this about what's not really effective to engage people, leaders are usually very shocked at what they hear. We are learning that telling people what to do is not helpful. If it's a simple task, like using a copy machine, that's a different story. But if we really want to help people solve problems differently than they have been in the past, if we want them to think at higher levels, and if we want them to come up with their own solutions, the brain behaves much like a 2-year-old when we tell it what to do, and it pushes back. That's why the behavior is modeled, the incentive and the use of incentives and threats, the old carrot and stick approach to trying to get people to change behaviors and develop new habits associated with leadership, is not very effective either. It actually ends up backfiring. We might get some short bursts of changes in behavior, but in the long run, they don't stick and they don't sustain, and we end up actually disengaging people from change. The behaviorist model, which is the kind of the use of the carrot and the stick, is the predominant model still in organizations. Since the 30s, since B.F. Skinner and John B. Watson brought this into the field of psychology, we have been using it since then to try to get people to change what they're doing. And it's not working. Giving advice is very similar. People don't want to be told what to do. They want to come up with their own insights, make their own connections, and own what it is that they want to change. The humanistic approach, which focuses on empathy and potential, it's a good idea. But a good example of the humanistic approach is kind of like the feedback sandwich, where we start out with something positive, put something that they need to change in there, and then we end it on a positive note. I've done it many times as a leader, but what I have learned is that it's really just, it's kind of a polite way of telling people what they're doing wrong. Again, the brain really does push back. So that is just really an overarching view of what's not working for us. We want to shift now and move to the next slide and talk about what is going to work for us. Before I do that, any thoughts on, Lacey, that you want to share about, what's not working and how that relates to the work you do in developing young leaders?
Yeah, I think the motivation piece that you're talking about is really important, because a lot of times young people will show up once or twice. You have this big event set up for them, or you have a board that you think, okay, we need young people to be here to give their voice, and we really want them to be involved, so let's set everything up for them, and then they'll come. And so you might get a few young people, or you might get a lot of young people at the beginning, and they're really excited, and then you get a few that come back the next time, and it kind of trickles down. And a lot of times what I hear from adults are, well, the young people just aren't motivated to keep coming. And I always push back, well, tell me about why you think they're not motivated. What is it that you think does motivate them? And so a lot of times we'll see adults that, they may not think that they're telling young people what to do, but if they are, offering a very structured type of event and scheduled and telling them exactly when and where to go and do things, that's still kind of telling them what to do. And I know you guys all, if you've ever worked with young people and you've tried to tell them exactly what to do, we know what kind of outcome that typically has, and they don't really enjoy that. Also, the incentives and threats, young people will come for pizza the first few times. That's enough incentive to get them in the door, but eventually, if there's not something else there that's motivating them, then the pizza's not going to be worth what else they want to do, what else they have going on in their life. And so that's, this approach and just thinking differently about how young people are motivated and how to engage them in these leadership activities, it's going to be really important, because a lot of times adults think that it's just that they aren't motivated, and I challenge them to think about how do you connect with what does motivate them and offer that as the opportunity.
Yeah, that's a perfect example of the use of incentives and how you might get a burst of change in behavior that looks like engagement, but it's really not deep engagement. Oh, thank you so much for that, Lacey. That's just perfect, and a really good preface to the rest of our conversation today. So just to dive in a little bit deeper here, there's a couple of areas of the brain that we're going to be referencing for the rest of this discussion that are pretty important. Obviously, there's a lot of other things going on in the brain that relate to engagement and change, but these are the two that are really most important to understand for this discussion. And if you look at the top layer of the brain, most of you probably know this, but that is referred to as our cortex, our neocortex. That is the newest part of our brain. That's the part of our brain that actually makes us human and different from lower primates. It is the part of our brain where we are able to actually think instead of just react. And if you'll look at the very the frontal lobe up near the forehead where the arrow is, that's called the prefrontal cortex. And that's the part of the brain that really helps us to engage in understanding things, helps us with decision making, with memory, and with recall. It's oftentimes called the working memory, because it's the place where we take in new information and we integrate it into what we already know and make meaning out of things. It's also the part of the brain where we can inhibit, so we can put on the brakes when we need to and inhibit impulses. If you look down at just a little bit in the midbrain, a little lower, there's something called the amygdala. Oftentimes that is referred to as the emotional part of our brain. Amygdala, a good way to remember that is that's actually a Greek word for almond, and it is almond shaped. We actually have two of them in our brain, and they're located within the limbic region. And when this is actually the region of our brain that detects things in our environment that we need to pay close attention to that could threaten our survival. I think most of the time we think about physical things that might threaten our survival. So for example, one time a few years ago, I was actually chased by a bear. During that time when I was chased by a bear, my amygdala in my limbic region was heavily activated. And what happened is the resources from my prefrontal cortex were recruited. And I did not have access anymore to my PFC. It wasn't a time for me to really think and create, although probably some creative problem solving would have been helpful actually, but I was not able to access any of those resources. There was a flood of neurochemicals that helped me to be physically stronger. So when the amygdala and the limbic region is activated, the higher regions of the brain are recruited. All of those resources and all of the blood flow goes to the amygdala so that we can react very quickly. Well, what we're going to talk about later on in this discussion is how this happens in social networks and social settings and in workplace settings, in our family settings, throughout the entire day. This is the same process that happened when I was chased by a bear and when cavemen were running from saber-toothed tigers, but now this is actually happening 24 hours a day, 7 days a week in our social settings. So we're going to talk about the implications of that. Next slide. So what does that have to do, what we just talked about with the brain, with actually changing behavior and changing habits and developing leadership effectiveness and the leadership qualities that we want to see in our adult leaders as well as our young leaders in systems of care? Well, it has quite a bit, it turns out. If we really want to change habits that are hardwired in our brain, we literally have to change the neural pathways. And so if we want an organization to change behavior, we have to change the brain circuitry of every human brain in that organization. If we want a system of care to engage in better practices that get the outcomes that we want for our young people and our families, we have to change the circuitry in the wiring of the brains. In order to change habits, old habits, we have to access the prefrontal cortex. We have to have access to that region of the brain. And that region of the brain is very fuzzy. It's limited in capacity. It is energy intensive. It uses much of the glucose that we take in. And it's easily distracted. It's only about 4 to 5% of our brain, but it's the part of our brain that helps us with that higher order thinking. And it's what we have to have access to that to change the brain circuitry. The other thing that's really important to think about when we're wanting to change behaviors and develop leadership is that people really do feel like they are their habits. And we have to be sensitive to what the implications of that are, because the habits are hardwired in our physiology. So when we ask people to do things differently, we're literally asking them to change their brains at a physiological level. Next slide. Lacey is going to talk a little bit, because of the uniqueness of the relationship between adult leaders and youth leaders in systems of care. If you have two adult leaders that are influencing each other's brain, that's a little bit of a difference, or to helping to influence each other's brain and helping to change each other's behavior. So for example, a supervisor wants a social worker to change their habits, and these are two adults talking to each other, then we're talking about changing brain circuitry. However, as Lacey noted earlier, because the frontal lobe, the prefrontal cortex of our young people is not fully myelinated and developed yet, we have an opportunity to not actually go in and try to necessarily change behaviors, but to actually influence how the brain develops. So Lacey, I'm going to just hand it to you and let you talk a little bit about that.
Sure. So I'm going to kind of build on a little bit of what Lori had mentioned. And if you guys have worked with young people, you will have at some point come across a young person who comes in and just thinks their life is over and it is the worst day in the world and my life just is awful. And you ask them, okay, and this, so it's very emotional, very limbic system centered. And you ask them, okay, so what happened? And they were like, well, this girl at school wore the same shirt as me today, and I'm just so embarrassed and my life is over. And so as adults, we kind of understand some of the implications that they're not necessarily as severe as the young person is experiencing them. However, as young people, they do primarily operate off of their limbic system, so their emotions are always going, and they see those things as much bigger deals than we do, and that's because they don't have access, like Lori said, to that prefrontal cortex, that higher level thinking to think, okay, is this really as big of a deal as I'm making it? How is this going to impact me later? Are people going to remember this next week? Probably not. But young people don't even have that tool to go to access that yet. And so as adult leaders, we need to keep that in mind with young people, that you're asking them to build a house and they don't have the wood, they don't have the hammers, they don't have the nails yet. And so you're really asking them to do a lot of things that are almost impossible. Now as they develop and as they get older, they're going to start having access to those as they develop. But keep that in mind with working with young people, is that they don't necessarily have the opportunity to access those same tools that we as adults have. So how you engage young people during this time really will influence how they develop into adulthood. Young people who don't have opportunities for leadership, they don't have good relationships with adults, they might not have somebody who can mirror how you can override that system to regulate your emotions and access that higher level of thinking. If they don't have that stuff, they're going to continue into adulthood, with the same behaviors and thinking the same, and everything is going to be a big, it's going to be more dramatic for them in their experience. And so the more that we can engage young people at this time and really mirror, the behavior that we want to see, you're really going to influence them as they're developing. Some of the things to keep in mind, and this was research done around transition planning, but I would argue that it has everything to do with adult relationships. Young people, we found research that if young people identify a positive adult connection that's permanent for them, then they have better outcomes than if they don't. And it doesn't have to be, a parent or, a caseworker or somebody like that. It can be anybody that they identify that they know is going to be there for them. And so we have to keep in mind that the research out there for, that helps determine good programming really has an influence on physiologically how these young people are developing.
Yeah, and that's just so powerful, Lacey. We are literally impacting our physiology, and you really put it into, it's a different context when we talk about influencing the physiology of our young people. And if we are not regulated and we are not, as adults, able to utilize the resources of our prefrontal cortex to really dampen down that limbic and regulate, then we cannot help someone else learn to do that. And we're going to talk a little bit more about how we do that and what the implications are. But you really highlighted how important it is for adult leaders to have those self-regulation skills so that they can help mirror that for our young people that need to learn the same skills. Next slide. So just to take this a little bit further and talk about what the implications for this are, one of the things that I'm really learning and that neuroscience is telling us is that change is literally painful. And I think if we're going to engage people in developing the leadership skills it takes to lead system reform and to engage others in change, we need to really keep this in the forefront. It literally provokes physiological discomfort because it uses those limited resources of our prefrontal cortex, and it requires creating those new circuitries and new mental maps in the brain. The connections literally have to be formed, which requires a lot of resources of the higher brain, and they have to continue to be focused on, which requires those resources, so that the maps can be developed for the new behaviors. Because of this, people avoid it. I would be willing to guess that there's a few of us on this webinar today that have fallen short with our New Year's resolutions. If that's the case, now you know why. It is literally uncomfortable to focus on change, but we're going to talk a little bit about why that's so and what we can do about it. Next slide. So let's just break this down a little bit further. We're going to talk about engagement. I think all of you would agree that the most robust predictor of success in change and in facilitating positive change in our system of care communities is engagement. We want high levels of deep engagement with our leaders, and we want leaders to be able to facilitate engagement of the people that are on the front line, that are in supervisory positions, and across systems. Without this engagement, we know that the change is very slow or stalled, or sometimes there's even regression. So what does it mean when we talk about the neuroscience of engagement? Well, the big takeaway here is that there is an organizing principle of the human brain that is always running and deciding whether or not we are going to move towards something or we're going to move away from something. This is called minimize danger, maximize reward. The brain is conducting an assessment on everything 5 times per second. So within this webinar, on this 60-minute webinar, your brain will have conducted an assessment approximately 18,000 times, and you're listening to the tone of my voice, the tone of Lacey's voice, the words that we're saying, what you see on the slides, the sounds around you, even the thoughts in your head, and you're deciding, is this going to help me survive, or is this something I need to move away from? And this goes on 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It never turns off. So this is playing out in our social environments. So huge implications for how we are developing as leaders and how we are trying to engage others in change. Next slide. So here's the good news. Within the idea of the organizing principle of the brain is that we want to minimize danger, maximize reward. And so when we are conducting that assessment that we do 5 times per second, and we feel like that we have assessed that this is something we want to move toward, so we feel like this is going to be rewarding to us. That's called a reward state. That's also known as engagement. This is the state that we want to facilitate in our young leaders, in our system of care change agents, and in our organizations. And I'll talk a little bit about why here. When we actually engage people and we activate the reward circuitry in the brain, we have a huge increase in access to our thinking resources. This is how we're able to access and maximize the use of our prefrontal cortex. Amy Arnston out at Yale University is doing some fabulous work on this. If you want to look more into that, the idea of how we increase our thinking resources. And we also increase our ability to produce creative ideas. We are able to take in more information. Our view is widened. We have a decrease in errors. We collaborate much more effectively. We get this nice burst of dopamine, which is a neurotransmitter that feels fabulous. And this neurotransmitter is really associated with the increase in insights. When we make new novel connections in our brains, those aha moments, those moments of insight, that's when we have that production of dopamine, we feel like collaborating with people, and we think so much better. Lacey, do you want to comment a little bit on how this relates to the work that you do in developing young leaders?
Sorry,
Lacey?
I was on mute.
Oh, that's all right.
Yeah, so whenever young people, when you're trying to engage them in these leadership activities, it's really important to meet them where they are. And so, again, we talked about, and we keep going back to this point, but their motivation is just a little different than, than what adults might be, and they may not be as poised to engage in higher level thinking right away. And so, so some of the motivations that you guys have to tap into of the young people are going to look a little bit different. I know we're going to talk about young adults and social contexts, but being able to access where the young people are, what they're thinking, what really motivates them, but then also thinking about how to create that environment to where young people do feel safe, where they do feel like they can kind of shut down those, like Lori had mentioned, where they're assessing everything all the time, especially for young people who have experienced trauma. And that is another overlay to keep in mind, because a lot of the young people that we work with have experienced that. And so they're always on alert, just like everybody, but it takes a little bit more to get them into a reward state, into a toward state. So making sure to create those safe environments for young people so that they can kind of let that down and truly be engaged in all of, all the things that Lori just talked about is going to be really important.
Yeah, that's just fabulous. You're absolutely right on, Lacey. Being able, I love to meet them where they are, and really creating that safe space so that you can get them out of the threat state. It made me remember that the threat state is really all of our default state. So we're more frequently going into the threat state. This is how we have survived for so many years. But what you just noted about young people who have experienced trauma, and this goes for the families that we work with as well, they are more frequently in a threat state, and that has a huge impact on their ability to creatively solve problems, engage in change, be able to see things from a different perspective. So really, really nice, Lacey. Thank you. Next slide. So let's talk a little bit about somewhat bad news. When we do this assessment and we decide that we need to move away from the situation and that this is not going to be rewarding, that this is actually threatening, we have a big change in our brain. This is when the limbic system is activated and then the resources are recruited from the higher levels of the brain. Now, extreme threat, such as the example I used before when I was chased by a bear, that's often referred to as the fight, flight, or freeze response. But you can actually have the slightest threat state activated, and you may not even know it by looking at someone. Again, it is our default state, and it doesn't take much at all to activate the threat circuitry. And it doesn't mean that people will run or they will fight or they will flee, but the same physiological process is going on in the brain. And when this happens, the slightest threat state as compared to the slightest reward activation, there's about a 50% reduction in our ability to access cognitive resources, in our ability to think creatively, in our ability to solve problems with new insights and be solution focused. We are more negative when the threat state is activated, and we see things from a more narrow point of view. And I'm sure all of us have felt that pain when someone is having a really bad day and they had a negative interaction with someone else, and maybe they feel like they take it out, we feel like they take it out on us. And that's because with the threat state, we really do generalize this to other contexts and the negativity as well as other people. So I'm guessing that there's probably already some insights and connections being made around why it's so important to try to activate the reward circuitry when we're developing leaders and when we're engaging in change in systems of care. Next slide. So what we've really been highlighting so far, we've talked about the organizing principle of the human brain to minimize danger, maximize reward, and I hope that you already see that, wow, our brain is actually quite social. It's actually deeply social. The human brain is the social organ. We talked about the organizing principle. The social aspect of the brain is really the operating network of the brain. When we are not engaged in something, a very specific activity, such as setting a goal or maybe dialing a phone number, we are thinking about ourselves and others. And this is why people are on Facebook when they are in their workplace setting. This is why social media is so important to us now. What we find in the brain, social motivators activate the reward circuitry, just like money does. And sometimes it can actually have even more of an impact. Next slide. Actually, can we back up, Nancy, go back? And we actually have a poll that we wanted to do in here. Can you put the poll out so people can see the question? Thanks so much. So which do you think is worse? Social pain, which is defined by being rejected or feeling ostracized, feeling like you're in the out group versus the in group, or physical pain, which is like a blow to the head, or being punched or hit in some way. Which is worse to you? How are we doing, Nancy? Are the polls coming in?
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, fabulous. Look at that. We've got a lot of smart people on this webinar. 4% physical pain is worse. Social pain, 69% is worse, and both are equal, about 27, looks like 27%. Yeah, wow, that's really fascinating to see those, to see that data and to see how people think about social pain. We're actually going to shift in and move into talking about social pain and what that has to do with developing leaders and engaging in change. So we can go ahead and go to the next slide. And this is really just some cutting edge, very new neuroscience. Naomi Eisenberger and Matt Lieberman at UCLA are doing some really fascinating research on how social pain is actually just as physiologically painful as physical pain. So a threat, for example, to someone's sense of status or their autonomy, or they feel like things might not be fair, is actually registering the same in the human brain as a blow to the head. So they're equal. However, what we're discovering is that social pain is actually a bit more painful than physical pain because we remember it. So we remember the pain of being bullied and being left out and being ostracized much longer and more intensely than we do the pain of a broken leg, for example. And so what has happened is that circuitry really piggybacked on our attachment circuitry. So when we were infants, we had to stay close to the caregiver. If the caregiver moved away too far, the physical pain registered in our brain, and we cried so that they would come back because it was a life or death matter. So the social pain, hurting socially, is actually, it really actually activates the part of our brain that says we might not survive. So huge implications for how leaders engage people in change and how adults engage young leaders in their development. Lacey, do you want to add something here?
Yeah, and thinking about, working with young people, like Lori mentioned, the exact same receptors go off if you experience social pain as if physical pain. And so a lot of times we'll see young people, they'll come to a group or something and then they end up not coming back. And a lot of times we mistakenly think, oh, they just aren't motivated, they're just not into this. But if they perceive any type of social pain there, and it doesn't even have to be that they were actually bullied or talked about or anything like that, but if they perceive to be on the outside of the group, that's the equivalent in their brain of walking into that situation and getting smacked with a 2x4, as Lori had told me before. So if we think about engaging young people in these leadership opportunities, we need to make sure that we are creating those environments for positive social connections among peers. We all know that peer connections are a huge piece of adolescent development, and so it's really important to make sure that we have positive and strong social connections. That can be one of the biggest motivators for young people to keep coming back to these leadership opportunities and to, because that's how we engage young people in systems change, especially considering the youth-guided principle of system of care. And so if adults go to a meeting and you get smacked with a 2x4, and you know that you're going to get smacked with another 2x4 the next time you go to the meeting, you're not really going to go back. Adults, however, can think, okay, you know what, I can withstand that and I can deal with that and go to the meeting anyway. But young people, like we said, don't really have that access. And so it's extremely important and often overlooked that we have environments and we create the, allow some time for young people to make those strong social connections and those positive social connections so that we can keep them engaged in these leadership roles.
Yeah, that's great, Lacey. You're right. It's like getting smacked by a 2x4, and why would you go back to that? Beautiful example. Thank you so much. Next slide. Actually, I think you just talked about the idea of the adolescent social brain, so we can go to the next slide. So we've been talking about how deeply social the human brain is, and if you haven't heard, I want to introduce you. I have to move quickly to the idea of to the insight that has come out in neuroscience over the past decade around how our brains and our minds are literally connected at the neurobiological level. So the minds and the brains of each of us are quite entangled. And what the neuroscience is telling us is this is happening through something called our mirror neuron system. These mirror neuron cells in our brain, they're just brain cells, but they actually mirror and light up and activate in our brains when we see someone or hear someone perform any kind of behavior. And what we have found is that if you kind of lifted up the hoods of two people's brains, if somebody was watching someone else do something, their brains are firing in the same way. So we're biologically doing what it is that we observe, which huge implications for observational learning. Big implications for a system of care leaders' impact on change, as well as the impact of adult leaders on our young leaders. Next slide. So our best friend and our biggest enemy is neuroplasticity. We talked earlier about when we want to engage in change and develop the leadership capacities that are going to help us create the reform that we want to see, we have to change brain circuitry. Well, the way that we do that is through our plastic brains. And we have to do this, we have to actually do this by paying attention to where we actually put our attention. What we have discovered in the past couple of decades is that the brain actually reorganizes and rewires throughout the entire lifespan. And the brain is sculpted and molded and shaped by our experiences and where we put our attention. This is why when we put attention on problems, which oftentimes the incentive and the threat approach does, we actually further embed the circuitry that's associated with problem behavior or behavior we want to get rid of. We have to focus on the solutions in order to create the new synaptic connections and the new mental maps to engage in change, to engage in new behavior. There's just a whole lot of information here to talk about. We don't have time today, but I think that neuroplasticity is really important to the work that, to the neuroscience of leadership. So next slide. We want to quickly introduce, we talked about the implications for activating the reward circuitry versus the threat circuitry in the human brain and how this plays a huge role in our ability to think and solve problems from a new way of looking at them. I want to introduce to you something called the SCARF model, which is coming out of the field of social and cognitive neuroscience, developed by David Rock. For more information on it, I have a link there that you can go. You can actually do your own assessment. What this says is that there's actually 5 domains where we can be activated into threat or into a reward state. And they are status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, and fairness. So for example, I talked a minute ago about if we actually feel like our status is getting threatened, then that activates the threat circuitry in our brain, which again really does lower our intellectual capacities and our ability to be creative. A sense of certainty, being able to predict the future and know what's going to happen. Autonomy, feeling like we have choices and we have say-so. Relatedness, feeling like we're safe with others. We're always constantly assessing for friend or foe. And when we assess that we are with friends, as Lacey noted, and we are in a safe place, our relatedness that domain can actually activate the reward circuitry in the brain and increase our thinking capacities. So there's a lot we could talk about here. I wanted to introduce you to this model. It's something I use with all of my coachees, and I know Lacey is going to be using it as well. So if you want to shift to the next slide, she's going to talk about a little bit about how she's going to use this framework to engage her youth in leadership.
Yeah, really quickly. I did take this assessment. It is really easy. It's free online, easy to find. It's like 15 questions. And it really does talk about what motivates people. And I'm using it with, I have a whole staff of young adults. And so I want to use this with them to find out what motivates them and what kind of things am I doing as a leader that pushes them away and disengages them. And so this can be used with youth or adults. But young people, utilizing this with my youth leadership board is something that I'm going to do and find out really what motivates them, what do I need based on their responses to create that environment that makes sure to allow them to be in the toward state and the engagement state and really minimize the things that could lead them into the threat or the away state. And this assessment, I think, lends a lot of insight into that.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Lacey. Beautiful. Next slide. So we want to just end with talking about what does work. We focus in the beginning on what neuroscience is telling us is not really effective, but what is working? What's working is activating the toward state, as Lacey just noted. This is something she's going to be more actively engaging her young people in doing, is how do they activate their own reward circuitry, and then how does she do that to help them to develop? How do we help people actually come to their own insights versus telling them what to do? Because we know that this is what actually helps people to learn. How do we really concentrate our attention on solutions and new habits instead of problems, which further embeds old circuitry? How do we quiet that brain and dampen the limbic? Because we know when the limbic is activated, the brain is very noisy. And when the brain is noisy, we don't hear those quiet insights. It's kind of like a cell phone in a rock concert. So we have to get that limbic dampened down so that we can hear those new novel connections. How do we actually lead with the social brain in mind, knowing that we're deeply social? And how do we increase our own levels of self-awareness about which domain, for example, could we get threatened into reward or get threatened into a way state? Or how do we actually use that framework for engagement to increase others' reward activation and regulate our own emotions so that we can socially regulate as well? Next slide. And of course, well, we believe, at least with the work that I do, 0-point leadership, we really do believe that if we want to develop leadership, we have to engage in brain development. The last slide is just our contact information for anybody who wants to contact us with questions.
Thank you so much, Lori and Lacey, for your wonderful presentation. We're sorry that we don't have time for questions today, so as you can see, Lori and Lacey have generously provided their contact information, so if you do have a specific question, you can contact them. This information will also be available on our website as we post the webinar, as well as the slides, and so you can also access their contact information there. So next slide, please. So thank you so much for attending our webinar, and thanks to SAMHSA and NIDR for providing the funding for this webinar, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you very much, and goodbye.